So if you press this, you've got, going to read you Harry Potter. You've chosen the best book ever. This is my favourite book of all time. So I'm going to read Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. This is book 1 out of 7, so if you are going to listen to me read and you're thinking this is a really awesome book, you can start off with this one and keep going. Yeah, alright, let's start off with chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just wouldn't hold up with any of that nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very long moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in handy when she spent much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but also they had a secret. And their greatest fear was that someone would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish-like as could possibly be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull, grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about that cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped happily away as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into the high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past their window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4 Privet Drive. It was on the corner of the street he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he had seen. Then he jerked his head back around and looked again. There, a tabby cat standing in the corner of Privet Drive. But there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and around the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign of Privet Drive. No, not reading. Looking at the sign. Cats can't read. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills. He was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help but notice there seemed to be a lot of people dressed strangely. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups that you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly to each other. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see a couple of them weren't young at all. Why? That man could have been older than he was. And wearing an emerald green cloak? The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that'd be it. The traffic jam moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past the broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed. As an owl after owl sped overhead, most of them had never seen an owl. Even at night time, Mr. Dursley, however, had preferably normal day, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important phone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He didn't know why, but it made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too. He said he couldn't see a single collection tin. It was on its way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag. He caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters! Yes, that's right. That's what I heard. Yes, they're their son, Harry." Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought he'd better not. He dashed across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, and seized the telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. But he put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking, no, he was not going to be stupid. Potters wasn't such an unusual name. He's sure there wasn't a lot of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, I'm not even sure his nephew is Harry. Might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She's always got upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He'd found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he'd left the building at 5 o'clock, he was so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted at the tiny old man, who stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem to be upset at all, and being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing can upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy day." The old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted at the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he had been called a muggle, whatever that's supposed to mean. He was rattled and hurried to his car and set off home. He was hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of an imagination. He pulled into the driveway of number 4, and first thing he saw, and he didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted this morning. This tabby cat he'd spotted this morning, it was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. This was normal cat behaviour. Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learnt a new word. Shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today, although Owls normally hunt at night and hardly ever seen in the daylight. There have been hundreds of sightings of these birds everywhere. Experts are unable to explain why owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself to grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to you, Jim McGruff. With the weather, going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's definitely not the only owls that have been acting odd today. Viewers, as a part of Kent, Yorkshire, Dundee, have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain that I promised yesterday, there've been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating a bonfire night. Bit early, not until next week, folks, but I can promise wet weather tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in the armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying in daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? A whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, have you heard anything about your sister lately? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls and shooting stars, and there are lots of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, you know, a lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her the name Potter. He decided that he didn't dare. Instead, he said casually as he could, their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject. As they went upstairs to bed, while Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it had got out that they were related to the pair, well, he didn't think he could bear it.